Barbara Chun had lived in Pinewood Shores for 23 years. At 64 years old, with her signature blonde wavy hair, red cat-eye glasses, and the red blazer she wore to every HOA meeting, she had become a fixture in the community. As a founding member of the Homeowners Association and current board treasurer, Barbara had watched their coastal neighborhood transform from a small development of 30 homes into a thriving community of 200 families. It was a crisp morning in October 2024 when Barbara stood in her kitchen, looking out at the Pacific Ocean. Her Mediterranean-style home sat on Seaside Drive, where she and her late husband Thomas had raised their 2 children. Thomas had passed away 5 years ago, but his legacy lived on in every corner of Pinewood Shores. He had been the HOA president for 12 years, always putting residents first, always fighting for fairness. Barbara's phone buzzed. It was a text from Margaret Foster, the HOA secretary and Barbara's closest friend in the community. Emergency board meeting. Richard called it. 9 a.m. Be there. Barbara frowned. Richard Blackwell had been elected HOA president just 6 months ago, in April 2020, after running an aggressive campaign promising modernization and efficiency. He was a 42-year-old real estate investor who had moved to Pinewood Shores only 18 months earlier. Something about him had never sat right with Barbara, but she had kept an open mind. Democracy was democracy, after all. She arrived at the community center at 8:45 a.m. The building sat in the heart of their development, surrounded by manicured lawns and the rose garden that Barbara herself had organized volunteers to plant 10 years ago. Margaret was already there, looking worried. "Barbara, thank God," Margaret said, rushing over. She was 61, with short gray hair and kind eyes that now showed concern. "Richard wants to vote on some major changes. He didn't give us any details, just said it was urgent." "Changes? What kind of changes?" Barbara adjusted her red glasses, a habit when she was thinking. "I don't know. He's been very secretive lately." "Have you noticed?" Barbara had noticed. In the past 2 months, Richard had been holding private meetings with certain board members. Excluding her and Margaret, he had also brought in his friend, David Thornton, as the new Community Compliance Officer, a position that had never existed before and that the full board had never voted to create. The other board members arrived. James Rodriguez, 68, a retired teacher who had served on the board for 15 years. Linda Patterson, 57, a nurse who loved organizing community events. And Frank Morrison, 71, a retired firefighter who took his board duties seriously. Then Richard entered. He was tall, with slicked-back dark hair, wearing an expensive suit that seemed out of place for a casual Saturday morning HOA meeting. His smile didn't reach his eyes. "Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming on short notice," Richard said, taking his seat at the head of the table. He placed a thick folder in front of him. "I'll get right to the point. Our community needs to generate more revenue. We're falling behind other developments in our area." Barbara raised her hand slightly. "Richard, our reserve fund has $1.2 million. We're actually in excellent financial shape. Thomas and I worked very hard to build that reserve over the years." Richard's smile tightened. "Barbara, I appreciate your past contributions, but times change. We need to think bigger. I'm proposing we implement several new revenue streams." He opened his folder and distributed papers. "First, we'll introduce guest parking fees. $20 per day for any non-resident vehicle." $20. James looked shocked. "That's excessive. People have family who visit. Friends. That would make Pinewood Shores very unwelcoming." "Second," Richard continued, ignoring James' we'll implement fines for any HOA violation. "First offense, $100. Second offense, $250. Third offense, $500. Linda gasped. "But we've always handled violations with warnings first, then friendly reminders. This community is built on cooperation, not punishment." Barbara leaned forward. "Richard, this is contrary to everything Pinewood Shores stands for. We're a community, not a business. Thomas always said. Thomas is dead, Richard cut her off sharply. Then he caught himself, softening his tone. I mean no disrespect to your late husband, Barbara. But he ran things his way. I'm president now, and I'm running things my way. The room fell silent. Barbara felt her face flush, but she kept her composure. She had faced down difficult people before. She raised her hand again, speaking calmly. These proposals need proper discussion and a full board vote. We also need to present them to the community. Our bylaws require resident input on major policy changes. Richard leaned back in his chair. Actually, I've reviewed the bylaws with my attorney. The board has authority to implement operational changes without resident approval. We only need a simple majority board vote. Frank, the retired firefighter, spoke up. His voice was gravelly but firm. I've been on this board since 2009. We've never made major changes without community meetings. It's not just about bylaws, Richard. It's about respect. I call for a vote, Richard said abruptly. All in favor of implementing the guest parking fees and violation fine structure. He raised his hand. Then, to Barbara's shock, so did Tom Choon, no relation to Barbara, despite the shared surname, a newer board member who had seemed reasonable until now. Tom was 53, had moved to Pinewood Shores 3 years ago, and owned a small construction company. Motion fails, Barbara said firmly. That's 2 votes. You need 4 out of 7. Richard's jaw clenched. This meeting is adjourned. We'll revisit this matter soon. As everyone filed out, Margaret grabbed Barbara's arm. Did you see Tom vote with Richard? I wonder what Richard promised him. Barbara had wondered the same thing. Over the next 2 weeks, she began to notice changes in Pinewood Shores. David Thornton, the new compliance officer, was patrolling the neighborhood daily, taking photos of homes and yards. Barbara watched from her window one morning as he spent 15 minutes photographing her neighbor's house across the street. The neighbor, Susan Martinez, had lived there for 17 years. She was a single mother of 2 teenagers, working as a teacher. Her house was always neat, her yard well-maintained. What could David possibly be doing? Barbara found out 2 days later when Susan knocked on her door, tears streaming down her face. Barbara, I got this, Susan said, handing her a letter. It was an official HOA notice of violation. Your mailbox post is faded and must be repainted within 14 days. Failure to comply will result in a fine of $100. Barbara examined the photo attached to the letter. She had to squint to see what they were talking about. There was a tiny spot on Susan's mailbox post, maybe 2 inches wide, where the white paint had faded slightly. This is ridiculous, Barbara said, raising her hand in a gesture of frustration. I'm going to talk to Richard. There's more, Susan said quietly. I got 3 other violation notices. My hedge is supposedly 2 inches too tall. My garden gnome violates the tasteful decoration clause. And my son's basketball hoop is 1 foot too close to the street. Barbara, I can't afford all these fines. I'm barely making ends meet as it is. Barbara felt anger rising in her chest. This wasn't the Pinewood Shores she knew. This wasn't the community she and Thomas had built. Don't worry, Suzanne. Don't pay anything yet. Let me handle this. That afternoon, Barbara drove to Richard's house on Ocean Vista Lane. It was one of the newer, larger homes in the development, worth about $1.8 million. She rang the doorbell. Richard answered, looking annoyed. Barbara, what can I do for you? We need to talk about these violation notices. Susan Martinez got 4 citations for things that are barely noticeable. This isn't right. Richard's expression hardened. Those violations are legitimate according to our CC&Rs. Covenants, conditions, and restrictions exist for a reason. The CC&Rs also require reasonable interpretation and application, Barbara countered. She held up the photo of Susan's mailbox. This is not reasonable. This is harassment. That's a serious accusation, Richard said coldly. If you're not happy with how I'm running things, perhaps you should resign from the board. Barbara stood her ground. She raised her hand. pointing at the violation notice. "I've been on this board for 23 years. I'm not going anywhere. And I'm going to call a special meeting to discuss these enforcement practices." "You can't call special meetings without presidential approval," Richard said. "Actually, any 3 board members can call a special meeting. It's in Article 7, Section 3 of our bylaws. I've already talked to Margaret and Frank. We're calling a meeting for next Tuesday at 7 p.m. Richard's face reddened. "You're making a mistake, Barbara." "No, Richard, you're the one making mistakes. And I'm going to make sure the whole community knows it." Barbara walked back to her car, her heart pounding. She had thrown down the gauntlet. This was war now, but it was a war she intended to win. Over the next few days, Barbara made calls. She talked to dozens of residents who had received violation notices in the past 2 weeks. The pattern was clear. Richard and David were targeting people who had opposed Richard's election or who had spoken up at board meetings. Maria Santos, a 69-year-old widow, had received a citation because her rose bushes extended 6 inches over her property line into the common area. Elena Rodriguez, James's wife, had been cited for having a political sign in her yard, even though the sign supported a local school bond measure and was clearly allowed under California law. The most egregious case was Henry and Ruth Washington, both 75 years old. They had lived in Pinewood Shores for 29 years, longer than almost anyone. Their citation stated that their home's exterior paint was not consistent with approved community color palette. Their house was beige, the same color it had been since 1995, long before there was even a formal color palette. Barbara documented everything. She created a spreadsheet showing every violation notice issued in the past 3 months. Under Thomas's presidency and the board leadership before Richard, the community averaged 15 violation notices per year, always with warnings first. Under Richard, in just 6 months, there had been 87 violation notices, with fines threatened immediately. She also discovered something else. Tom Chun, the board member who had voted with Richard, had received a contract to provide construction services for a proposed new community clubhouse, a project Richard wanted to push through without competitive bidding. The contract was worth $350,000. On Tuesday evening, the community center was packed. Word had spread, and over 150 residents showed up. This was the largest turnout Barbara had seen since 2019. When the community voted on whether to add a second swimming pool, Richard looked nervous when he saw the crowd, but he maintained his composure. This special meeting was called by Barbara Chun, Margaret Foster, and Frank Morrison. "Barbara, you have the floor." Barbara stood. She had dressed carefully, her red blazer, professional but approachable, her red glasses clean and polished. She had notes, but she didn't need them. She knew every detail. "Thank you all for coming," Barbara began, raising her hand in a welcoming gesture. "I've been part of this community for 23 years. My husband Thomas and I moved here when this was just a dream of what a neighborhood could be. Together, we built something special, a place where people look out for each other, where we solve problems with conversation, not confrontation, where we are neighbors, not adversaries people know dead." Barbara saw familiar faces throughout the crowd. These were her people. In the past 6 months, something has changed. 87 violation notices have been issued. Compare that to 15 in all of 2023. Our neighbors, good people who have lived here for decades, are being threatened with fines for minor, often invisible issues. She held up the photos of Susan's mailbox, Maria's rose bushes, Henry and Ruth's house paint. These are not violations that threaten our community. These are pretexts for generating revenue and exercising control. Richard stood up. "Barbara, you're out of line. I'm not finished," Barbara said firmly, but calmly. She remained standing. "I've also discovered that board member Tom Chun has received a $350,000 no-bid contract for construction work, shortly after voting with President Blackwell on controversial measures. This appears to be a conflict of interest," the crowd murmured. Tom Chun's face went pale. "Furthermore," Barbara continued, "I've reviewed our financial records. Our HOA fees were raised 15% in July 2024, supposedly for maintenance and improvements. but our actual maintenance costs have not increased. Where is that money going? Richard's lawyer, who Barbara hadn't noticed before, stood up. Mrs. Chun, these accusations are slanderous. You could be sued for defamation. Barbara smiled slightly. She had been ready for this. She raised her hand calmly. I have documentation for everything I've stated. Financial records, emails, contracts, all obtained legally through my role as board treasurer. I've prepared copies for anyone who wants them. Margaret and Frank began distributing folders to the audience. Barbara had been thorough. I'm proposing 3 motions tonight, Barbara continued. First, we suspend all violation enforcement until the board conducts a comprehensive review of our policies with community input. Second, we require competitive bidding for all contracts over $50,000. Third, we call for a special election to recall President Blackwell and hold new elections within 60 days. The crowd erupted in applause. Richard was shouting something, but his words were drowned out by the noise. David Thornton, the compliance officer, was taking photos of the crowd, trying to intimidate them. It wasn't working. Susan Martinez stood up. I second all 3 motions. I third them, shouted Henry Washington. Barbara looked at Richard. His face was red, his hands clenched into fists. But he was outnumbered, and he knew it. The community had spoken. We need a board vote, Richard said tightly. Barbara nodded. Let's vote. All board members in favor of suspending violation enforcement pending review. Barbara raised her hand. So did Margaret, Frank, James, and Linda. That was 5 votes out of 7, more than enough. Motion passes, Barbara said. All in favor of requiring competitive bidding for contracts over $50,000. Same 5 hands went up. Motion passes, and finally, all in favor of calling for a recall election. 5 hands again. The community erupted in cheers. Richard grabbed his briefcase and stormed toward the door. You'll regret this, Barbara. All of you will. But Barbara knew they wouldn't. As she watched Richard leave, surrounded by grateful neighbors, she felt something she hadn't felt in months. Hope. The battle was just beginning, but Pinewood Shores was fighting back. And with Barbara leading the way, they had a chance to reclaim their community. She raised her hand one more time. This time in a gesture of unity, as 150 voices joined together in conversation, planning, and renewed purpose. This was what community meant. This was what Thomas had always believed in, and Barbara would make sure their legacy survived. The morning after the special meeting, Barbara woke to find her front yard vandalized. Someone had spray-painted the word troublemaker across her driveway in bright red letters. Her mailbox had been knocked over, and her carefully tended rose bushes had been trampled. She stood in her bathrobe at 6:30 a.m., staring at the damage. Her neighbor, Michael Chung, no relation, despite sharing her late husband's surname, came running over from across the street. Barbara, oh my God, who would do this? Michael was 38, a software engineer who worked from home and had become like a son to her since Thomas passed away. I have a pretty good idea, Barbara said quietly. She pulled out her phone and took photos from every angle. But we'll need proof. Margaret arrived 20 minutes later, bringing coffee and a concerned expression. I got the same treatment, she said, showing Barbara photos on her phone. Margaret's garage door had been spray-painted with resign, and her car's tires had been slashed. Frank, too, Margaret added. Someone threw eggs at his house and smashed his porch light. Barbara felt anger rising, but she kept her voice steady. She raised her hand in a calming gesture. They're trying to intimidate us. It won't work. By 9 a.m., Barbara had filed police reports for herself. Officer Jennifer Walsh, who had lived in Pinewood Shores for 8 years, took the reports seriously. Mrs. Chun, this looks like targeted harassment, Officer Walsh said. She was 34, professional and thorough. The timing right after the HOA meeting isn't coincidental. Do you have any security cameras? I installed one last year, Barbara said. She pulled up the footage on her phone. The video showed a dark sedan pulling up at 3:15 a.m. Two figures in hoodies got out, vandalized her property, and left. The license plate was partially visible. Officer Walsh zoomed in on the image. "I'll run this plate. We should have some answers soon." While they waited for the police investigation, Barbara focused on the recall election. According to Pinewood Shores bylaws, they needed signatures from 30% of homeowners. That meant 60 signatures to trigger a recall vote. They had 60 days to collect them. Barbara set up a table outside the community center that Saturday. She wore her red blazer and red glasses, looking every bit the community leader she had always been. Margaret and Frank joined her, along with Susan Martinez, Henry and Ruth Washington, and a dozen other residents. The response was overwhelming. By noon, they had collected 47 signatures. By 3 p.m., they had 90. People weren't just signing. They were sharing their stories. Elena Rodriguez, age 59, told Barbara about the citation she received for having a solar panel installed on her roof. Richard said it violated the aesthetic standards, but the CC&Rs specifically allow solar panels. California law protects our right to have them. Marcus Williams, a 45-year-old attorney who lived on Harborview Drive, signed enthusiastically. "I've reviewed your documentation, Barbara. Richard's conduct could constitute breach of fiduciary duty. If you need legal help, I'm volunteering my services pro bono." Barbara felt tears forming behind her red glasses. She raised her hand to wipe them away quickly. "Thank you, Marcus. That means everything." By 5 p.m., they had 138 signatures, more than twice what they needed. The recall election was officially happening. That evening, Barbara received an unexpected visit. Tom Chun, the board member who had voted with Richard and received the suspicious construction contract, stood at her door, looking uncomfortable. "Barbara, can we talk?" he asked. She invited him in, wary but willing to listen. Tom sat in her living room, his hands clasped together. "I made a mistake," Tom began. "Richard approached me in June 2024. He said the community needed upgrades, that we could both benefit. He offered me the clubhouse contract before the board even discussed the project. I should have known it was wrong." Barbara listened carefully, her expression neutral. "I voted with him because I thought the money would help my business," Tom continued. "My construction company was struggling. I have 12 employees depending on me. But after last night, seeing what he's doing to people like Susan and the WASHINGTONS. I can't be part of this anymore." "What are you saying, Tom?" Barbara asked. "I'm returning the contract. I'll vote against Richard on everything from now on, and I have something you need to see." He pulled out a folder from his briefcase. "These are emails between Richard and David Thornton. They've been planning this for months. It's all about generating revenue and taking control." Barbara opened the folder. The emails were damning. In one from May 2024, Richard wrote, "We need to maximize fine revenue. Target the older residents first. They're less likely to fight back and more likely to pay." Another email from July 2020 detailed a plan to force out longtime residents by making life difficult for them, then buying their properties through Richard's real estate company at below-market prices. "Tom, this is evidence of elder abuse and fraud," Barbara said, her voice shaking slightly with controlled anger. "This goes way beyond HOA. Mismanagement." "I know," Tom said quietly. "I'm giving you copies of everything. I've already sent the originals to my lawyer for Richard doesn't know I have these." After Tom left, Barbara called Marcus Williams immediately. Then she called Officer Walsh. By midnight, they had a plan. The next few weeks were intense. Richard fought back hard. He sent letters to all homeowners claiming that Barbara was destabilizing the community and that the recall was financially irresponsible. He estimated it would cost the HOA $15,000 to conduct the special election. Barbara countered by showing that regular elections cost approximately $12,000, so the difference was minimal. She also pointed out that Richard had spent $23,000 on his compliance officer, David Thornton, in just 6 months, money that could have been saved entirely. Richard tried another tactic. He called a board meeting and proposed suspending Barbara's access to HOA financial records, claiming she was misusing her treasurer position for political purposes. The vote was 3-4 against the proposal. Barbara, Margaret, Frank, James, and Linda voted no. Richard, David Thornton, who Richard had somehow added to the board without a proper vote, and reluctantly one other member voted yes. But it wasn't enough. "This isn't over," Richard said coldly, glaring at Barbara across the table. "You're destroying everything I'm trying to build here." Barbara stood up, raising her hand in a firm gesture. "No, Richard, you're destroying everything Thomas and I built over 23 years. But we're taking it back. The recall election was scheduled for December 15th. Both sides campaigned intensely. Richard spent money he didn't have authorization to spend, nearly $40,000 on glossy mailers, robocalls, and even a website attacking Barbara personally. Barbara's campaign was grassroots. She and her supporters went door to door. They held coffee meetings in people's homes. They listened to concerns and documented every grievance against Richard's administration. One evening in late November, Barbara visited the Washingtons. Henry and Ruth had been married for 52 years. Their home was filled with photos of children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. They had been pillars of Pinewood Shores since "Barbara, we've been thinking about leaving," Ruth said softly. She was 75, with white hair and gentle eyes that now showed sadness. The stress of these violations, Richard's harassment. "It's too much at our age." "Please don't let him win," Barbara said, taking Ruth's hand. She felt the older woman's hand trembling. "You built this community as much as anyone. Your home is beautiful. You've done nothing wrong. We're just so tired," Henry added. He was also 75, a retired postal worker who had served his country in Vietnam. "We don't have the energy to fight like you do." Barbara squeezed Ruth's hand gently, then raised her other hand in a determined gesture. "Then let me fight for you. That's what I'm here for. That's what Thomas would have wanted." The Washingtons agreed to stay, at least until after the election. But Barbara knew there were others like them, longtime residents being pushed out by Richard's aggressive tactics. 2 weeks before the election, the police investigation bore fruit. Officer Walsh called Barbara with news. "We traced the license plate from your security footage," Walsh said. "The car is registered to David Thornton, Richard Blackwell's compliance officer. We're bringing him in for questioning." David Thornton cracked quickly under police interrogation. He admitted that Richard had paid him $500 to vandalize Barbara's property, and similar amounts to vandalize Margaret's and Frank's properties. He also admitted to issuing violation notices based on Richard's targeting list, not actual property inspections. Richard was arrested on December 1st, 2024, charged with conspiracy to commit vandalism, intimidation, and fraud. The arrest made the local news. The headline read, "HOA President Arrested in Harassment Scheme." Barbara watched the news coverage from her living room. She should have felt vindicated, but instead she just felt sad. Sad that it had come to this. Sad that someone had tried to corrupt the community she loved. Margaret called immediately. "Barbara, we won. Richard's going to jail." "Maybe," Barbara said carefully. "He has bail, and the recall election is still happening. He could technically still be president until the votes are counted." Richard did make bail, $50,000, posted by his real estate company. He immediately went on the offensive, claiming he was innocent and that Barbara had orchestrated a witch hunt against him. "This is political persecution," Richard shouted at a hastily called press conference outside the community center. A small group of his supporters stood behind him, maybe 15 people out of 200 families. "Barbara Chun is afraid of progress. She's afraid of change. She wants to keep Pinewood Shores stuck in the past." Barbara watched from her window. She didn't respond publicly. She didn't need to. The facts spoke for themselves. The week before the election, Barbara organized one final community meeting. Over 180 residents attended the largest turnout in Pinewood Shores history. Barbara stood at the podium, wearing her red blazer, looking out at her neighbors. She raised her hand in greeting. and the room quieted. 23 years ago, Barbara began. My husband Thomas and I moved to Pinewood Shores. It was just 30 homes back then, built around a dream of what community could mean. Thomas served as HOA president for 12 years. He always said, our job wasn't to rule over people, but to serve them, to protect what makes this place special. People nodded, many remembering Thomas fondly. In the past 6 months, we've seen what happens when that principle is forgotten. When power becomes more important than people. When profit becomes more important than neighbors. We've seen 87 violation notices issued where 15 would be normal. We've seen elderly residents targeted for harassment. We've seen contracts awarded through favoritism. We've seen vandalism and intimidation. Barbara paused, looking around the room. But we've also seen something else. We've seen this community come together. We've seen neighbors helping neighbors. We've seen people standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult. We've seen the true spirit of Pinewood Shores. The applause started slowly, then grew into a standing ovation. Barbara felt tears behind her red glasses again. She raised both hands in a gesture of gratitude. Susan Martinez stood up from the audience. Barbara, you've done so much for us. When you're elected president, because we all know you're going to run, what's your first priority? Barbara smiled slightly. Actually, I'm not running for president. The room went silent. Margaret looked shocked. Even Frank seemed surprised. I'm 64 years old, Barbara continued. I've served on this board for 23 years. It's time for new leadership. Younger leadership. I'm endorsing Marcus Williams for president. He's 45, he's brilliant, he cares about this community, and he has the energy to take us forward. Marcus Williams stood up, looking stunned. Barbara, I had no idea. ... Double quotes. I'll stay on as treasurer, Barbara said, raising her hand to quiet the murmurs. I'll keep our finances transparent and our reserves strong. But the presidency needs someone who can give it their full attention. Someone who represents the next generation of Pinewood Shores. The applause was deafening. Marcus made his way to the podium, shaking Barbara's hand, then hugging her. I won't let you down, he said. I know you won't, Barbara replied. On December 15th, 2024, the recall election took place. The turnout was unprecedented. 193 out of 200 eligible households voted, a 96.5% participation rate. Barbara spent the day at the polling station, greeting neighbors, answering questions, and simply being present. She wore her red blazer and red glasses, but she wasn't campaigning. That work was done. The votes were counted that evening at the community center. Barbara, Margaret, Frank, James, Linda, and dozens of residents waited for the results. Richard wasn't there. He had stayed home, his lawyers having advised him against making public appearances while under criminal indictment. The volunteer counting committee announced the results at 9:30 p.m. The recall of Richard Blackwell as HOA president, 178 votes in favor, 15 votes against. The recall passes by overwhelming majority. The room erupted in cheers. Barbara raised her hand high, not in triumph, but in relief and gratitude. The election for new HOA president Marcus Williams, 162 votes. Write-in candidates and abstentions. 31 votes. Marcus Williams is elected president of Pinewood Shores HOA. More cheers. Marcus hugged his wife, then made his way to Barbara. Thank you, he said simply. Thank you for being willing to serve, Barbara replied. Now the real work begins. As the crowd celebrated, Barbara slipped outside to the rose garden she had planted 10 years ago. The December evening was cool, the ocean breeze carrying the scent of salt and possibility. She thought about Thomas, about the community they had built together, about everything they had fought for. She raised her face to the stars and smiled. We did it, Thomas, she whispered. We kept our promise. Behind her, the community center glowed with light and laughter. Inside, her neighbors, Her friends were celebrating not just a political victory, but the restoration of their community's soul. Barbara knew the fight wasn't completely over. Richard's criminal trial would take months. There would be healing to do, trust to rebuild, policies to reform. But tonight, for the first time in 6 months, Pinewood Shores felt like home again. She raised her hand one more time, a gesture of farewell to the old chapter and welcome to the new. Then she turned and walked back inside, ready to help guide her community into whatever came next. The guardian of Pinewood Shores had prevailed, and the shore was secure once more. January 1st, 2025 dawned clear and bright over Pinewood Shores. Barbara stood on her deck, coffee in and watching the sunrise paint the Pacific Ocean in shades of gold and pink. It was a new year, and it felt like a new beginning for the community she loved. Marcus Williams had been sworn in as HOA president on December 20th, in a ceremony that felt more like a celebration than a bureaucratic formality. Over 150 residents had attended, bringing potluck dishes and genuine smiles. It was the kind of gathering Thomas would have loved. Barbara's phone buzzed. It was Marcus. "Good morning, Barbara. Happy New Year. Are we still on for our 9 a.m. meeting?" "Absolutely," Barbara replied, raising her coffee cup in a small gesture of enthusiasm, even though he couldn't see her. "I've prepared the financial reports you requested. We have a lot to discuss." At 9 a.m. sharp, Barbara arrived at the community center wearing her red blazer and red glasses. Marcus was already there, along with Margaret, Frank, James, and Linda. The entire board was present for their first official meeting of the new administration. "Before we begin," Marcus said, standing at the head of the table, "I want to thank all of you for your service during these difficult months. Especially Barbara. Without your courage and leadership, we wouldn't be here today." Everyone applauded. Barbara smiled and raised her hand in acknowledgement. "We all played our part. Now let's focus on healing and rebuilding." The first order of business was reviewing all the violation notices issued under Richard's administration. Barbara had compiled a comprehensive list, 87 notices in total, affecting 63 different households. "My recommendation," Barbara said, distributing folders to each board member, "is that we void every single one of these citations. They were issued improperly, often maliciously, and don't reflect our community values." Linda, the nurse who loved organizing community events, spoke up. "I agree completely, but we should also establish new guidelines so this never happens again. We need a fair, transparent violation process with multiple levels of review," Marcus. "Excellent point. Let's form a policy committee." "Barbara, would you chair it?" "I'd be honored," Barbara replied, "but I think we should include residents who aren't on the board. People like Susan Martinez, the Washingtons, Elena Rodriguez. Those who were directly affected by Richard's policies. They should have a voice in creating the new system." The board voted unanimously to void all 87 violations and establish a community-wide policy review committee. Barbara felt a weight lift from her shoulders. This was what good governance looked like. Over the next 2 weeks, Barbara held 4 community meetings to gather input on new HOA policies. The turnout was remarkable, averaging 90 residents per meeting. People were engaged, hopeful, and ready to contribute. At the first meeting, held on January 8, 2025, Susan Martinez made an impassioned speech. She was 39, a single mother and teacher who had nearly lost her home under Richard's harassment. "For 6 months, I lived in fear," Susan said, her voice shaking slightly but growing stronger. "Fear of opening my mailbox, fear of another citation. Another fine I couldn't afford. But Barbara showed me that we don't have to accept abuse. We can stand up. We can fight back. And we can win." The room erupted in applause. Barbara raised both hands in a gesture of appreciation and solidarity. She saw tears in many eyes, including her own, behind her red glasses. Henry Washington, 75 years old and a Vietnam veteran, stood up next. "My wife Ruth and I almost left Pinewood Shores after 29 years. 29 years, but Barbara convinced us to stay, to fight, and I'm glad we did." This is our home. Nobody should ever feel driven out of their home. The policy committee worked tirelessly throughout January. They created a new violation process that required 3 elements. First, a friendly notice, giving homeowners 30 days to address any issue. Second, a follow-up visit from a board member to offer assistance. And third, only after those steps, a formal citation that could be appealed to the full board. No more surprise fines, Barbara explained at a board meeting on January 22nd. No more targeting vulnerable residents. Every homeowner deserves respect and due process. The board approved the new policies unanimously. Marcus signed them into effect on January 25th, 2020. But not everything was resolved. Richard Blackwell's criminal trial was scheduled for March 3rd, 2025. His charges included conspiracy to commit vandalism, intimidation of witnesses, fraud, and elder abuse. The district attorney's office had taken the case seriously after reviewing the evidence Barbara, Tom Chun, and Officer Walsh had provided. Barbara was called to testify. So were Margaret, Frank, Susan, the Washingtons, and nearly 20 other residents. The trial would be difficult, forcing everyone to relive the trauma of Richard's administration. On February 15th, as treasurer, she had uncovered some disturbing information during her audit of Richard's spending. "Marcus, look at this," Barbara said, spreading documents across the table. She raised her hand to point at specific line items. Richard spent $47,000 on consulting fees to David Thornton over 6 months. But David wasn't a consultant, he was a harassment officer. This money was spent illegally. Marcus studied the documents, his expression growing darker. "Can we recover it?" "We can try," Barbara said. "I've been working with our attorney. Since Richard is under criminal indictment, we can file a civil lawsuit to recover funds. We could potentially get back not just the $47,000, but also the $23,000 he spent on unauthorized mailings, the $15,000 on the bogus compliance software that was never implemented, and various other expenses. That's $85,000 total," Marcus calculated quickly. $85,237. To be exact, Barbara corrected, showing him the spreadsheet she had meticulously prepared. Money that should have gone to actual community improvements. The board authorized Barbara to work with their attorney to file the civil suit. It was filed on February 28, 2025, just 3 days before Richard's criminal trial began. The trial lasted 2 weeks. Barbara testified on March 5th. She wore her red blazer and red glasses, looking professional and composed as she took the stand. The prosecutor, Assistant District Attorney Jennifer Torres, was 43 and had a reputation for Mrs. Chun. "How long have you served on the Pinewood Shores HOA board?" Torres asked. 23 years, Barbara replied clearly. "And in those 23 years, how many homeowners were cited for violations requiring immediate fines before Richard Blackwell became president?" 5. Total. Over 23 years. And those were for serious safety violations like structural issues that posed immediate danger. And during Mr. Blackwell's 6 months as president, 87 citations, many for things like minor paint fading or plants extending a few inches over property lines. Barbara explained the targeting of elderly residents, the pattern of harassment, the spray painting of her driveway. She showed the jury the photo of Susan Martinez's mailbox, the one with a tiny 2-inch faded spot that had been cited as a major violation. During cross-examination, Richard's attorney tried to paint Barbara as a bitter opponent who couldn't accept new leadership. "Mrs. Chun, isn't it true that you opposed Mr. Blackwell from the beginning?" the defense attorney asked. Barbara raised her hand slightly, a gesture she made when choosing her words carefully. "I had concerns about some of his proposals, but I voted for several of his initiatives when they made sense. What I opposed was harassment, targeting vulnerable residents, and financial impropriety. Those aren't political differences. Those are ethical violations." The defense attorney tried again. "You led the recall effort against my client, didn't you?" "I helped organize it." "Yes, along with 138 other residents who signed the recall petition." "Are they all bitter opponents too?" Or did your client earn that recall through his own actions? The judge had to quiet the courtroom after that response. Susan Martinez testified on March 7th, describing how Richard's citations had nearly bankrupted her. The Washingtons testified on March 9th, explaining how they had almost left their home of 29 years due to harassment. Tom Chun testified on March 11th, admitting his own complicity and explaining how Richard had corrupted the board. The most damning testimony came from David Thornton, who had taken a plea deal in exchange for his cooperation. He testified that Richard had explicitly instructed him to target specific residents, particularly elderly homeowners and those who had opposed Richard's election. He told me to make their lives difficult, David testified. He said if we could force them to sell, his real estate company could buy their homes below market value, then resell them for profit. He called it strategic community improvement. The jury deliberated for only 6 hours. On March 17, 2025, St. Patrick's Day, they returned with their verdict. Guilty on all counts. Richard Blackwell was sentenced on April 2, 2020. He received 3 years in state prison for the conspiracy and fraud charges, plus 5 years probation after release. He was also ordered to pay restitution of $85,237 to the Pinewood Shores HOA, plus an additional $42,000 to individual residents he had harmed. Barbara attended the sentencing with Marcus, Margaret, and about 30 other residents. When the judge announced the sentence, she didn't celebrate. She simply closed her eyes and raised her hand to her heart, feeling relief rather than triumph. Outside the courthouse, reporters surrounded the group. Barbara spoke on behalf of the community. Justice was served today, she said simply, but our work isn't finished. We have a community to heal and a future to build. That's where our focus needs to be now. Back in Pinewood Shores, the healing process continued. In March, the policy committee had completed their work. The new HOA guidelines were comprehensive, fair, and designed to prevent abuse while still maintaining community standards. Barbara organized the Community Appreciation Day on April 12, 2020. It was a beautiful Saturday, and over 175 residents came to the park for a potluck celebration. There were games for children, music from a local band, and a genuine sense of joy. Marcus gave a short speech, thanking everyone who had fought to preserve their community. Then he called Barbara to the microphone. Barbara Chun has been the heart and soul of Pinewood Shores for over 2 decades, Marcus said, raising his hand toward her. She stood up when standing up was dangerous. She fought when fighting seemed impossible. And she never, ever gave up on us. The crowd erupted in applause. Barbara felt tears streaming down her face behind her red glasses. She raised both hands in gratitude. This community belongs to all of you, Barbara said into the microphone, not to any one person or any board. You are Pinewood Shores, your voices, your values, your commitment to each other. That's what makes this place special. Thomas and I always believed that, and I promise you I will spend whatever time I have left making sure we never forget it. More applause, more tears, more hugs than she could count. In May, the financial recovery was complete. Rich's assets had been seized to pay the restitution. The HOA received its $85,237. Individual victims received their compensation. And David Thornton, who had cooperated fully, received a reduced sentence of 1 year in county jail plus community service. Barbara presented a proposal to the board on May 20th, 2020. I recommend we use the recovered funds to establish the Thomas Chun Community Fund, she said, her voice steady but emotional. The money will be used for residents facing financial hardship, medical emergencies, job loss, unexpected expenses. No one should feel they might lose their home because of temporary difficulties. The board approved unanimously. The Thomas Chun Community Fund was established with an initial balance of $85,237. Susan Martinez was the first recipient, receiving a grant to help with her daughter's college expenses. Throughout the spring and summer of 2025, Pinewood Shores transformed. The fear and tension of Richard's administration faded, replaced by renewed community spirit. Elena Rodriguez organized monthly book clubs. Henry Washington started a veteran support group that met every other Tuesday. Linda Patterson resumed her community events, movie nights, holiday celebrations, summer barbecues. Barbara continued as treasurer, but she also became something else, a mentor. Young families moving into Pinewood Shores would often seek her advice. She became known for sitting on her deck in her red blazer and red glasses, always available for a conversation, always ready with wisdom and encouragement. On August 23, 2025, Pinewood Shores held its annual homeowners meeting. It was the largest turnout in community history. 196 out of 200 households represented. Marcus gave his report on the year's achievements. The new violation policies had resulted in only 3 citations all year, all 4 genuine safety issues that were resolved cooperatively. The community's reserve fund had grown to $1.3 million. Property values had increased by an average of 8%, outperforming the regional average. But numbers don't tell the whole story, Marcus said, raising his hand to gesture around the packed room. Look around. This is what success looks like. Neighbors who care about each other. A community that stands together. That's Barbara's legacy. That's Thomas's legacy. And now it's our legacy to protect. The crowd gave a standing ovation. Barbara stood with everyone else, clapping for her community, for their resilience, for their future. After the meeting, as residents mingled and children played on the lawn outside, Barbara found herself standing in the rose garden again. The roses were in full bloom, their fragrance filling the evening air. Margaret joined her, bringing 2 glasses of lemonade. We did it, Barbara. We really did it. Barbara smiled, raising her glass in a toast. We did. And you know what the best part is? What? It's not over. The story continues. New families will move in. Children will grow up here. Challenges will come and go. But the foundation is strong now. The values are clear. That's what matters. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the sun set over the Pacific Ocean, painting the sky in brilliant colors. Barbara thought about the journey from Thomas's death 5 years ago, through Richard's corruption, to this moment of peace and renewal. She had been called a troublemaker, had her property vandalized, had been threatened and attacked. But she had never wavered, because some things are worth fighting for. Community is worth fighting for. Home is worth fighting for. She raised her hand one more time, a gesture not of goodbye but of welcome to whatever came next, to whoever needed help, to the continuing story of Pinewood Shores. The Guardian was still on duty, and the shores remained secure. September 20th, 2025. Barbara Chun sat in her kitchen, reading the morning newspaper, when an envelope arrived that would test everything she had fought for. The return address made her hand tremble slightly. California State Prison, San Luis Obispo and Richard Blackwell. She set down her coffee, adjusted her red glasses, and carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter on prison stationery. Dear Barbara, I know you probably don't want to hear from me. I understand, but I'm writing because I've had 6 months to think about what I did, and I need you to know something. I'm sorry I was wrong. About everything. The violations, the harassment, the greed, it consumed me. I hurt good people, I hurt this community. I hurt you. And I'm truly, genuinely sorry. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I don't deserve it, but I wanted you to know that your fight wasn't in vain. You showed me what real leadership looks like, what real character looks like. Thank you for standing up to me. You saved Pinewood Shores from what I had become. With sincere regret, Richard Blackwell. Barbara read the letter 3 times. Her emotions swirled anger at what he had done, skepticism about his motives, but also something unexpected. Compassion. She raised her hand to her chest, feeling her heartbeat, wondering what Thomas would have done. Should she respond? Should she share this with the community? Should she believe him? What would you do in Barbara's situation? Would you trust this apology? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Barbara decided to bring the letter to the next board meeting on September 20th. She walked into the community center wearing her red blazer, carrying the letter in a folder. Marcus, Margaret, Frank, James, and Linda were already seated. I received something unusual, Barbara said, distributing copies of Richard's letter. I wanted the board to see it before I decided how to handle it. The room fell silent as everyone read. Frank, the retired firefighter, spoke first. It could be a manipulation tactic. He might be trying to reduce his sentence or get early parole. Or, Linda suggested gently, it could be genuine. People can change. Prison gives time for reflection. Marcus leaned back in his chair. Barbara, what does your gut tell you? Barbara raised her hand in a thoughtful gesture. Honestly, I don't know. Part of me wants to believe people can change. Thomas always believed in second chances. But part of me remembers Susan Martinez crying in my doorway, remembers the Washingtons almost leaving their home of 29 years. Those wounds don't heal with one letter. I think you should respond, Margaret said quietly. Not because he deserves it, but because you. Whatever you need to say to him, say it. Get closure. The board agreed to let Barbara handle the situation as she saw fit. That night, she sat at her desk with a pen and paper, composing a response. She wrote, crossed out, and rewrote. Finally, at 11:30 p.m., she had her answer. Richard, I received your letter. I appreciate you taking the time to write it, and I want to believe your apology is sincere. But forgiveness isn't simple. You didn't just hurt me, you hurt elderly veterans, single mothers, and dozens of families who trusted you. True redemption isn't a letter. It's action, it's living differently. It's making amends, not with words, but with how you treat people when you're released. I hope you mean what you wrote. I hope you've truly changed, but only time will tell. Barbara Chun, she mailed the letter the next morning and tried to move on. But then, on October 3rd, 2025, something unexpected happened that would shake Pinewood Shores to its core. A new family moved into the house on Osha Vista Lane. The house Richard Blackwell used to own. The family seemed nice enough. Jonathan and Michelle Harper, both in their early 40s, with 2 teenage children. They introduced themselves at the October community meeting, bringing cookies and smiles. We're so excited to be part of Pinewood Shores. Michelle said, we've heard wonderful things about this community. Everyone welcomed them warmly. Barbara shook their hands, raised her hand in greeting, and thought nothing more of it, until October 15th, when Marcus called an emergency board meeting. We have a problem, Marcus said, his expression grim. A big problem. He slid a document across the table. It was a lawsuit, filed by Jonathan Harper against the Pinewood Shores HOA, claiming that the recall election of Richard Blackwell had been conducted improperly and that all actions taken by the illegitimate board since December 15th, 2024, were Barbara felt her stomach drop. She raised her hand to her forehead, processing this information. Who is Jonathan Harper, really? Marcus pulled out another document. Richard Blackwell's brother and Michelle Harper is Richard's sister. They bought his house through a shell company, and now they're trying to overturn everything we've accomplished. Here's the shocking twist. The battle wasn't over. What do you think will happen next? Drop your predictions in the comments. The lawsuit claimed that the recall election violated HOA bylaws because the vote was conducted by mail-in ballot rather than in-person voting. It was a technicality, but it was there in the original bylaws from 1990. All elections for HOA officers must be conducted in person at a duly noticed meeting. The bylaws had been written 27 years ago, before mail-in voting was common. Everyone had assumed it would be acceptable, especially given the high turnout and overwhelming majority. But, technically, legally, the Harpers might have a case. Barbara studied the lawsuit documents with Marcus and their attorney, Marcus Williams's friend Jacob Chun, no relation to Barbara, despite the shared surname. Jacob was 40 at a HOA law specialist who had seen similar cases. This is frivolous, but it could tie us up in court for months, Jacob explained. The legal fees alone could drain your reserve fund. And if they win on a technicality, every decision made since the recall could be challenged, including the voiding of all those violation notices. Margaret Sider, face pale. Susan, the Washingtons. Everyone. They could all face those fines again. Not just fines, Jacob added. The Thomas Chun Community Fund. The new policies, even the restitution payments, everything could be reversed. Barbara stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the community she loved. She raised both hands in a gesture of frustration. This is exactly what Richard wants. He can't attack us directly from prison, so he's using his family to do it. The question is, Marcus said, how do we fight this? Over the next 2 weeks, Barbara worked tirelessly. She researched HOA law, consulted with Jacob, and reviewed every detail of the recall election. She discovered something interesting. While the original bylaws from 1998 required in-person voting, an amendment passed in 2016 allowed for mail-in ballots in special circumstances. Look at this, Barbara said at a board meeting on October 28th, raising her hand to point at the document. Article 12, Section 7, amended on June 23, 2016. It says the board may authorize alternative voting methods, including mail-in ballots, when in-person attendance would create undue burden or, when circumstances warrant, increased participation. The recall was during flu season. We had elderly residents who couldn't risk exposure. And we wanted maximum participation, Marcus said, his eyes lighting up. That's exactly what this amendment covers. Jacob reviewed the amendment. This is solid. The Harpers' lawsuit is based on outdated but this amendment supersedes the original requirement. But there was a problem. The amendment had never been properly filed with the county recorder's office, which meant technically it might not be legally valid. It was another oversight, another technicality, another potential weakness. So here's the million-dollar question. Should Barbara and the board fight this in court, risking time and money, or should they try to negotiate with the Harpers? What would you do? Tell us in the comments. Barbara made a decision that surprised everyone. On November 1st, 2025, she knocked on the Harpers' door. Michelle Harper answered, looking uncomfortable. Mrs. Chunai, we weren't expecting you. May I come in? Barbara asked calmly. She wore her red blazer and red glasses, looking professional but approachable. Michelle hesitated, then opened the door wider. Jonathan Harper was sitting in the living room, and he stood up defensively when he saw Barbara. I'm not here to fight, Barbara said, raising both hands in a peaceful gesture. I'm here to talk. Person to person, neighbor to neighbor. We're just exercising our legal rights, Jonathan said stiffly. No? And you might even win on technicalities. Barbara sat down, uninvited but not aggressive. But let me tell you what you'll actually win. You'll win the destruction of a community. You'll win hundreds of thousands of dollars in legal fees, money that could go to schools, parks, and helping neighbors in need. You'll win the hatred of 199 families who will know exactly why their lives have been disrupted. Michelle and Jonathan exchanged glances. Barbara continued, her voice steady but passionate. Richard hurt people, real people. Susan Martinez, a single mother who almost lost her home. Henry and Ruth Washington, Vietnam veterans who almost left after 29 years. Is that the legacy you want to fight for? Richard is my brother, Michelle said quietly. He made mistakes, but he's still family. I understand, Barbara said, and she meant it. She raised her hand to her heart. I lost my husband 5 years ago. I know what family means, but family doesn't mean enabling harm. It means holding each other accountable. It means helping each other become better. Barbara pulled out Richard's letter from her purse. Your brother sent me this from prison. Et apologiseth. He acknowledged what he did wrong. Are you honoring that apology by trying to undo the consequences of his actions? She handed the letter to Michelle, who read it with tears forming in her eyes. I don't want to destroy what you've built here, Michelle said softly. I just ... Richard called us, said he was being persecuted, that the trial was unfair. He said people lied about him. Then let me introduce you to those people, Barbara said. Come to our next community meeting. Meet Susan, meet the Washingtons, meet the dozens of families who were affected. Hear their stories. Then decide if you still want to fight this lawsuit. Jonathan looked skeptical, but Michelle nodded slowly. Okay, we'll come to the meeting. The community meeting on November 8th, over 180 residents attended, many having heard about the lawsuit and the Harpers' presence. Barbara had asked Susan Martinez, the Washingtons, and several others to share their stories, not with anger, but with honesty. She stood at the back of the room, raising her hand occasionally to encourage speakers, but mostly just letting the community speak for itself. Susan told her story about the mailbox citation and the fear of losing her home. Ruth Washington described receiving violation notices for a house that had been the same color for 29 years. Elena Rodriguez explained how she was cited for solar panels that state law explicitly protected. Michelle Harper sat in the audience, tears streaming down her face. Jonathan sat beside her, his expression gradually softening from defensive to understanding. When the testimonials ended, Michelle stood up. Her voice shook as she spoke. "I owe all of you an apology. Jonathan and I filed that lawsuit without understanding what really happened here. We believed Richard's version because he's family. But after hearing your stories, after reading his letter to Barbara, I realized we were wrong." She looked at Barbara. "Mrs. Chun, we're withdrawing the lawsuit. Today, right now, I'll call our attorney first thing in the morning." The room erupted in applause. Barbara raised both hands, tears behind her red glasses, feeling relief wash over her. Jonathan stood up to, "We want to be good neighbors. If you'll have us, we want to be part of this community the right way. Not fighting you, but joining you." Marcus stood and extended his hand. "Welcome to Pinewood Shores, the real Pinewood Shores." In the weeks that followed, the Harpers became genuine members of the community. Michelle joined Linda's event planning committee. Jonathan volunteered to help Henry Washington with the Veterans Support Group. On December 15, 2025, exactly 1 year after the recall election, Barbara stood in the Rose Garden again. It was evening, and the community had gathered for a celebration, marking 1 year of renewal. Marcus presented Barbara with a plaque to Barbara Chun, Guardian of Pinewood Shores, in recognition of 24 years of service, leadership, and unwavering dedication to community values. Barbara raised the plaque with both hands, showing it to the crowd, tears flowing freely now. "This belongs to all of us," she said. "Every person who stood up, every person who refused to give in to fear, every person who believed community matters more than profit." She looked around at the faces gathered in the garden. Susan Martinez with her daughters, the Washingtons holding hands, Marcus with his family, Margaret beaming with pride. Even Michelle and Jonathan Harper, who had found their place in this community. "Thomas and I moved here 24 years ago with a dream," Barbara continued. "A dream of neighbors who care for each other, who protect each other, who build something bigger than themselves. That dream was tested this year. It was attacked, it was nearly destroyed. But it survived. Because of you. What do you think makes a community strong? Is it rules and regulations? Or is it people who care? Share your thoughts below." As the celebration continued, Barbara slipped away to a quiet corner of the garden. She looked up at the stars, just as she had 1 year ago after the recall vote. "We did it, Thomas," she whispered. "Not just survived. We grew stronger." She thought about everything they had been through, Richard's corruption, the vandalism, the trial, the lawsuit. Each challenge had tested them. Each challenge had revealed their true character. And they had passed every test. Barbara knew there would be more challenges ahead. There always were. New residents, new issues, new conflicts. But she also knew that Pinewood Shores had something precious, a foundation built on genuine community values, tested by fire and proven strong. She raised her hand one final time, a gesture of gratitude to the universe, to Thomas, to everyone who had fought beside her. Then she smiled, a genuine, peaceful smile. The story of Pinewood Shores wasn't ending. It was just beginning a new chapter. And Barbara Chun, at 65 years old, wearing her signature red blazer and red glasses, was ready for whatever came next. Because some legacies aren't about buildings or rules. They're about people. They're about standing up when it's hard. They're about believing community matters. They're about being a guardian when others need one. And Barbara would always be a guardian. So what did you think of Barbara's journey? Have you ever had to stand up against corruption or injustice in your own community? Share your story in the comments. We'd love to hear from you. And if this story inspired you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you never miss another amazing HOA drama story. The shores of Pinewood remained secure, and the guardian remained on watch. Always